right, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for our conversation on advocacy. And I use that term conversation very intentionally because I want this to be a conversation. I'm not going to lecture to you. I'm going to talk with you because you know what? Everybody has a story. With the healthcare system, everybody has a story. Sunitra is handing out, an evaluation that I would like for you to complete for me when I finish. She's also handing out a bookmark and a little piece I put together called Betsy's Rules for Courage and Confidence, because that's what we're going to talk about today, courage and confidence. How can a man who feels so good be so sick? My husband Jack asked the oncologist when he heard those words no one wants to hear. You have cancer. It was August of 2014. Jack was 75 years old, playing tennis 2 or 3 times a week with people a third his age. At that time we were up in North Carolina because after Hurricane Ivan left, we did too. And went to North Carolina for 10 years. And that was the beginning of his 4-year war. Yes, war with cancer. This was not a battle. Fortunately, we lived near a research teaching hospital, and that was the hematologist-oncologist that he chose to go see. And those 2 guys formed a very fast friendship. As a matter of fact, my dear Jack would send the hematologist research reports. And then when he'd go see him, he'd say, "Hey, Doc, did you see that research report I sent you?" Why is that important for me to say? Because one of the things a good advocate does is their own research. And if you don't know how to research or you don't like to research, what would you do? What would you do if you wanted to research bone marrow cancer? Google it? Yeah? What if you don't like to Google? Or you don't trust Google? Speak to someone that's had that experience. Talk to everyone. Yeah. And let me give you a clue. Librarians love to do research. And whether it's a public library, university library, whatever, they are a resource that I think maybe we forget to go to. Okay, it's August 2014. Jack's feeling tired. He has bone marrow cancer. We're at a research teaching hospital. I'm very comfortable with the care he's getting, as is he. The doctor had a clinical trial going on, and he got Jack into the clinical trial. And Jack said to me, even if it doesn't do me any good, it might save somebody else's life. So he went through the clinical trial, which at one time necessitated us driving 30 minutes to the hospital every day. Every day. One of those days, during a 2-week period of time, the research nurse says to me, he's got to have another test performed within 30 minutes of the last chemo. So I'll take him down to the lab, and you check out, and then we'll have him down there. I said, well, thanks. So it took me about 30 minutes to check out because it was a healthcare facility and it was huge and it took a while. So I walk into the waiting room and I look around and there's Jack in the corner in a wheelchair, asleep. We're now at 30 minutes. And I shrieked, "What's my husband doing out here?" Fortunately, a brave lab tech came out and said, "Ma'am, do you have a problem?" And I said, "Do I have a problem? You got a problem." Because this man's test was supposed to have started right this minute. What's he doing out here? We didn't know he was down here. That's the instant I realized I could not trust the healthcare system to take care of him. Jack lived for 4 years with bone marrow cancer. Average is 2 years. He is a hell of a fighter. Sorry, God. He went through clinical trials. He got better. He went into remission. He got worse. He got better. He would get intravenous chemo on the top of his hand and say to the nurses, "Wrap it up tight, I'm going to play tennis tonight." And he did. After 3 years, the same month Jack was diagnosed with bone marrow cancer, my 6-year-old third cousin was diagnosed with leukemia. And they live out in the middle of nowhere, Texas. And he and she formed a friendship virtually. And he would send her cards. And they would trade pictures of each other getting chemo. And at the age of 8, she was proclaimed leukemia-free. Amen. Texan, and I'm a Texan. You know, we'll throw a party over anything or nothing. So her family threw her this big party. Brisket, all the things one would have at a Texas party. And Jack said, "We're going to Aspen's party." I said, "I don't think that's a good idea. You don't need to be in a plane around a lot of people. Your immune system is back down." And he said, "No one's going to tell me what to do at this time in my life." And we went to Texas. I've never pushed a wheelchair so far in my life as I did going through the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. We get to Texas, everything's okay. We go to this big party, and Jack starts feeling really bad. So bad that he asked to go back to my cousin's house. We took him back to my cousin's house, and about midnight he said, "I want to go to the emergency room. I'm having a pain here." I said, "Honey, it's midnight in the middle of nowhere, Texas. We'll go to the emergency room when the sun comes up." And of course, the sun came up very shortly after that. Here's my second story. Get him to the emergency room, tells the doc, "I've got a pain here, kind of have trouble breathing." He was in and out of AFib forever. I mean, not just 4 years, but for a long time. So the doc gets him laid out and gives him some pain meds, IV. Jack starts to relax. Doc says, "Okay, you can take him home." My cousin and I get him in the car to go to her house. And I said, "Did that doctor take an x-ray? He was complaining of not breathing?" She said, "No, he didn't." That was my first memo to the hospital CEO. This has happened. I used to be provost of the Warrington campus at PSC when it was PJC. So I know how to talk to docs and CEOs, and didn't realize it at the time, but it was great training. Next day, Jack's admitted. Now remember, this is a little tiny hospital out in the middle of nowhere, Texas. And now he's got an oncologist, he's got a hematologist, he's got a cardiologist, he's got an endocrinologist. And here's what I learned. Every single one of those doctors was treating a disease, not my husband. I'm pretty sure they didn't do a very good job of communicating with each other either. I'm going to stop here to see if anybody has any comments, questions, story they want to share. Yes, ma'am.
I have lots of stories. We subsided, but of course there's that rehab time, right? So from the hospital to the rehab, there was an order missed for her pneumonia medication that she got from laying in a bed for 10 days. And wasn't very long after that my grandmother just passed away because the assisted living hospital forgot the order for her pneumonia medication. That was probably not the first experience, but I've lost a lot of people. I've been a caretaker for a pretty long time. I started out as a CNA, and I took care of my father who had lung cancer. So a lot of things that you said about, why isn't he in his, treatments yet? Why didn't we have an x-ray for this? Why are we just using chemotherapy? Why aren't we using any alternative therapies? Really just, I was 19 at that time, so it was hard for people to take me seriously as an advocate. And when my grandmother passed away, I was on that hospital so much. I was trying so hard. I didn't have access to her records though, because the head nurse isn't here every time I ask to see her med list. The head nurse isn't here. Right now I'm currently dealing with a son who has interstitial cystitis. He's 19 years old. Probably nobody in this room has ever even heard of it. And there's no cure for it. There's no treatment for it. It's just something you just have to have. And what it does, it affects your bladder. It's like he has lesions inside his bladder, like a cat was in there scratching away, trying to get out. And so it's painful for him to hold urine. It also affects all other reproductive systems having to do with your bladder, right? So he's a 19-year-old man, and that's what he's dealing with. No cure, no treatment, and whatever the treatment used to be, I think it causes heart failure now. So they won't even offer it to him because of his age.
Have you taken him to MD Anderson or to Shands or to Mayo or?
No,
Well,
I won't
do it.
because I'm concerned with the treatment they might get.
Well, it can't be worse than what he's getting.
He's found ways to treat himself. He's been his own advocate. He realized eating certain foods triggered his symptoms more. And so he's just been calculating everything he does.
Good.
So
and
that
he can write the next book.
Yeah.
he needs to write a book.
Yeah.
That's what I tell him.
Yeah.
But he definitely just calculates everything. He's on a very strict regimen, very strict diet. He doesn't cook with us. He doesn't allow our food near his food. He doesn't do anything that'll put him in a predicament that might trigger himself.
I gave via Zoom, of course. And one of the Rotary Club members invited me to talk to his real estate team. And when he introduced me, he said, when I heard Betsy speak about advocacy, he said, I realized I have no legal right if my 21-year-old daughter is hit by a truck tonight. I have no legal right to advise on her treatment because they had not, when she turned 21, done the power of attorney, done the medical power of attorney, all those kinds of things. And that's a population I had not even thought about. So, thank you.
So what I'd like to about, so I'm looking forward to reading your book. So I live in a space, so just the word advocacy. So we in our culture, you're not a team player. And so I'm looking forward to reading your book because we have to advocate for ourselves.
There's a time not to be a team player.
It's true, it really is. And so it reminds me of the time that my wife had injured her finger, had gone, they had taken an x-ray, and they were passing around. So she said to the nurse, may I have a copy of the x-ray? And the nurse said to my wife, we've already put that away, but she's married to me. She says, no, I don't think you understand. It's my x-ray, and you're going to give me a copy.
And by the time she got to check out, they had a copy. But if you don't do that, and so we're wired with fear and intimidation. Those are very false kinds of things to keep us in check. So I'm looking forward to reading your book.
And I understand healthcare professionals. As we say in Texas, they put their pants on one leg at a time, just like we do. But they're busy. And they have lots of patients. I only had one. 10 days later at the hospital in nowhere, Texas, I always got to the hospital at 6 o'clock in the morning. The nurse and I would go over his chart. They'd do a blood draw at midnight. They'd do another one at 6 o'clock in the morning. So we're standing there looking at the monitor. I don't know what I'm looking at, but she's talking me through it. And she said, "Oh my, that can't be right." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "His counts have doubled since midnight last night. That can't be." She went tearing down that hallway. Next thing I knew, I had 20 people in the room, from the phlebotomy department to the vice president for quality. They had interchanged Jack's name label with some other man's. And if she hadn't caught it, 2 people would have died. And then a lot of people would have died because I would have, by Ned, taken them out. But we caught that. 10 days later, there's a staff person in the hospital called the hospitalist. You know what a hospitalist is? That's the doctor that only works in the hospital. And in this little hospital, we had a different hospitalist every week. And the communication was no better between them than they were with other people. So 10 days after mixing his name tag up, the hospitalist comes into the room and he said, "Ma'am, I know you want to get back to North Carolina. I'm going to release him to go by ambulance. 27-hour drive." And I said, "You have got to be kidding me. I'm not putting him in an ambulance for a 27-hour drive." And if anything had happened, they would have stopped wherever they were, and that would be as far as we went. "Yes, ma'am." Okay. By this time, all 4 of Jack's grown children, and I mean grown, they are in their 50s, because we married late in life, and I was a trophy bride. They were all there, one from Canada, one from Wisconsin, one from North Carolina, and one from Virginia. And they stayed a couple weeks with us. Next week, the same hospitalist comes in and said, "I'll release him to fly commercially." And I said, "You are out of your mind. I'm not putting him on a commercial airline. 1, he can't stand. And 2, no, we're not doing that." That was my 3rd memo to the hospital CEO. So after he left, I called the social worker who was paid by the hospital. I called the advocate who was paid by the hospital. And I said, "I want answers, and I want them in 2 hours. I want my husband back in North Carolina." And the social worker, bless her heart, said, "We're doing the best we can." And I said, "That's not good enough." Hung up the phone, looked at his kids, and said, "I'll be back." And off I went to find the hospital CEO's office. And someone said, "Well, how did you know where it was?" "Well, you walk down the halls and you say, 'Where's the CEO's office?' And you ask somebody else, 'Where's the CEO's office?'" So I get to the CEO's office and walk in, and his administrative assistant comes out and says, "Hi, may I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm Betsy Smith." And she said, "Oh, I recognize that name." And I said, "I want to talk to Mr. Smith." And she said, "He's in a very important meeting." I said, "What could be more important than the spouse of a man who's been here almost 3 weeks?" "He's with his lawyers." And I said, "He better be." And she said, "I'll call you when he finishes." I said, "That's fine. I'll just sit right here and wait for him," and plopped down and waited in his outer office until he finished with his lawyers. When he finishes, she comes out. She sweeps him away. He comes back so gracious, so very nice. "Miss Smith, come in. How can I help you?" I said, "I want my husband back in North Carolina. I want him back tomorrow." And the poor unfortunate man said, he can stay here as long as he needs to. And I said, you're killing him. I want him back in North Carolina tomorrow. I had already done research on what they call air ambulances, businesses, and had moved the money in case I had to pay for it to get him back. So the hospital CEO and I are chit-chatting, and finally I leaned across the conference table and I said, look. Oh, sorry. I said, look, you make sure it's worth it to you and this hospital not to get my husband back to North Carolina tomorrow. And he said, well, I've looked into whatever company it was, and I just can't afford that. And again, I said, you make very sure it's worth it to you and this hospital not to get my husband back to North Carolina tomorrow. He said, is that a threat? I said, take it how you want to. I want him back in North Carolina tomorrow. $40,000. Learjet. So I get back up to the room and Jack says, tell him we'll split the cost. I didn't have to. He was in Jack's room within 30 minutes with papers for me to sign, and we were on a Learjet the next morning and back in North Carolina by 2 o'clock the next afternoon. Now, I know not everybody has my personality. I know not everybody was raised in Texas by a little 5-foot-tall woman with a square jaw and said, Betsy, you can have whatever you want. Go get it. So when we got to the teaching research hospital, the doc there said, oh, you're the woman stirring up all the trouble. Yes, yes, I am. I bought Jack 3 or 4 months, but he didn't die there. And after he did die and I could collect myself, I put my lawyer network, Texas Lawyer Network, together and said, I want the biggest malpractice lawyer you can find. And I got a call from him, of course. And he said, ma'am, I've looked over your case. It'll cost $240,000 just to get the research done. And ma'am, you can't win against a hospital in Texas. The legislature has made sure of that. So I let that go. And again, I tell the story because I don't want to be everyone's advocate. I want everyone to be their own advocate. And I want everyone to have the courage and confidence to say, no, or I don't understand that. Will you use words I can understand? Or I want a second opinion. I have several stories in the book of other people who went through healthcare issues. And one of them is a retired hospice chaplain, female. And even she had difficulty when her husband got very sick. And she would say to me, well, Betsy, you know, sometimes you can get more done with honey than vinegar. I said, I tried the honey, didn't work. Went straight to the hard stuff. But I do want people to be aware. I don't think doctors and nurses and technicians are evil. They're just human. And they're overworked. And they're trying to run a business while practicing medicine. So I wrote the book, the Patient Advocacy Handbook, for people to read and say, oh, I could do that. Oh, you mean I could ask that? I talked to a very successful businessman, and his 80-something-year-old mother got taken to the hospital. She'd been there a couple of days, and he was in the room with her, and she said to the nurse, I'm having a heart attack. And the nurse said, no, you've just got indigestion. And the woman died. And I said, you didn't call for a charge nurse? You didn't call for a doctor? You didn't call for an advocate? So he said, I didn't know. I didn't know what to do. So the purpose of the book is written to encourage us normal folks to stand our ground and to advocate not only for ourselves, but for those we love in the healthcare system.